me host. Do you want to change? Yes. Okay. You're in charge.
Great. I am the host now. Okay, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
We'll call the court to order at this time. This is Matt Rothy. I'm the multi-jurisdictional municipal judge for the city of Stoughton, towns of Dunkirk, Pleasant Springs, and Rutland. Normally at this point, I go through my opening comments. Where this is, I'll note for the record that is June 17th, 2020. This is adult court night for Stoughton Municipal Court. We're conducting it by Zoom. We have a listing of defendants that were scheduled to appear tonight. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, this court is elected to appear by Zoom. We sent out instructions on how to appear by Zoom. Mary, correct me if I'm wrong. My clerk is Mary Giemza. That nobody responded to the Zoom meeting or asked for the Zoom ID. Is that correct?
Correct.
So we did receive a number of plea agreements. I'm checking with Zoom. I'm in the gallery view. There's 4 participants right now, and that's myself appearing remotely. My clerk Mary Giemza appearing remotely. John Montgomery is the Information Technology Director for the City of Stoughton. He's also appearing, as is WSTO TV. Is this being broadcast live via WTSO? Do you know, Mary?
It was supposed to be, but I'm not sure because there were no participants if they decided to hold off. Derek or John, can you answer that?
No, you are being recorded and broadcast.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So this is broadcast live on WSTO. Okay, so those are the 4 participants. I'm checking and I don't have any other participants. So what we're going to do is we're going to progress with court right now. I have a listing. I'm going to go down one by one. If I receive anybody calls in the next between now and 6 p.m. we'll take their call, but for the moment, I'm just going to go ahead and review the list by an alphabetical order. The first case we have is Katie Alvarez Varela. Katie Alvarez Varela, cited for, we're going to default Miss Alvarez Varela, and I'm going to impose the face amount of citations. We're going to, Mary, did we decide on 60 or 90? Did we discuss the time to pay? Would 60, go ahead.
I thought we had said 60 because most of these have been rescheduled since March and April.
So we're going to give 60 days, but if anybody is watching, if they need more time, I would ask that they write the court and just request more time. Because this is a pandemic, because this is unusual, we're all appearing remotely, I'm going to treat most motions to reopen liberally, generally permit them. I'm also going to treat most extensions to pay for the forfeitures liberally as well. As long as people ask for a reasonable amount of time, I'm inclined to grant that motion. So we'll default Ms. Alvarez Varela and impose the face amount of the citation. And Mary, if I'm going too fast, just let me know. All right. The next case we have is Troy Mitchell Arnold. And we're going to default Mr. Arnold. The next case we have is Gary Babler. Mr. Babler paid the bond forfeiture, and since he paid the bond forfeiture, I'm going to forfeit the bond and find Mr. Babler guilty. We'll treat it as a no contest plea. Next case we have is Jonathan Bass. 3 citations, and Mr. Bass sent in a guilty plea via the sheets we sent in. In other words, we sent in a previous document indicating they could enter a guilty, no contest, or not guilty plea. Mr. Bass elected to enter a guilty plea, and I'm going to, and it's my notes say to see plea sheet, so I'm going to go ahead and access that. Okay, so according to the plea sheet, Mr. Bass did get insurance after the incident. So he's faced with three citations: failure to stop at stop sign, operating motor vehicle without insurance, and operating while revoked. So he admitted to basically driving and apologized. I'm going to go ahead and dismiss the operating motor vehicle without insurance citation on the court's motion due to the fact he obtained insurance, and I'm going to default him on the failure to stop at stop sign and operating while revoked. So I'm going to default him on both of those and find him guilty. Impose the face amount of the citations. Okay. The next name on the docket is Heather Beecher. I'm going to, let me check. I'm still only seeing 4 participants, myself, my clerk, Mary Giemza, Information Technology, and WSTO. Seeing no appearances for Heather Beecher, Ms. Beecher is defaulted, and I'm going to impose the face amount of the citation. Next is Linda Bernal Val. Cited for operating without a valid license. The bond forfeiture, the bond amount was paid, so I'm going to forfeit the bond, treat this as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. The next case I have is Tyler Stephen Bickle. Mr. Bickle paid the amount owing on the citation. I'm going to forfeit the bond, find that the defendant has entered a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Mary, so far so good?
Yep, good.
All right, good. I'm probably going much slower than I normally do in court, so. Okay, next case we have is Cortez Braxton. Seeing no appearances via Zoom, court will default Mr. Braxton and find him guilty. Next is Madeline Rose Clark. According to my notes, Ms. Clark paid for the bond. We're going ahead and forfeit the bond, treat that as a no contest plea, and I'll find the defendant guilty. Next is Holly Helen Cole. Based upon the non-appearance of the defendant via Zoom, I'm going to default the defendant and find the defendant guilty. Next is Todd Anthony D'Antoni. Mr. D'Antoni paid the bond, so I will forfeit the bond, treat this as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Next would be Michael Dodge. There's no one on Zoom. I'll default to the defendant. For the record, I'll note that it's 5:08 p.m. The court directed them to call in by 5. Default to defendant and find the defendant guilty. Next is Lori Duane. Ms. Duane paid the bond, so I'm going to forfeit the bond, treat that as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Next would be Adrian Briona Farrow. I'm not seeing anybody on Zoom. I'll find the defendant in default and find the defendant guilty. Next would be Patricia Marie Flynn. Ms. Flynn paid the bond. I'll forfeit the bond, treat this as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Next would be Cesar Keyshawn Fuentes. I'm not seeing anybody on Zoom. Based upon the non-appearance, I'll find the defendant in default, and I'll find the defendant guilty. Impose face amount of the citation. Next would be Emmanueline Annabelle Garside. No contest plea received. There is no face sheet on this, Mary?
I sent a quick email saying she'd like to enter a plea of no contest.
Okay. Court will accept a no contest plea, find her guilty, and then impose the standard, as all these cases, 60 days to pay. All right. Next is Stoney Gilbertson. Seeing no appearances via Zoom, find the defendant guilty, or in default, and find it guilty. Now, this was a arrest. There was I've been found the defendant guilty of retail theft, potentially taking less than $500. However, due to the COVID-19, I'm not going to impose any restitution. If the victims would request a restitution, require at this point that they fill out a restitution form, submit that to the court, and we will conduct a restitution hearing on a future court date. All right, you ready for page 2?
Yes.
Rusdy Grinka, let me check. I don't see any participants in Zoom. Nobody, just the same 4 appearances as stated before. Myself, the clerk, the information technology, and WSTO, find the defendant in default, and I'll find the defendant guilty. Next would be Morgan James Hack. The defendant paid the bond. I'll forfeit the bond, treat this as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Next would be James Hammis. Seeing no participants via Zoom, find the defendant in default for both citations and find the defendant guilty of both citations. Next would be Robert Harp. Find the defendant has paid the bond. I'll forfeit the bond, treat that as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Next would be Robert Harrison. I'll find that Mr. Harrison has paid the bond. I'll forfeit the bond, treat that as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Next would be Michael Ray Helsel. Seeing no I'm seeing no appearance via Zoom. And contrary to the notice, I'll default the defendant and find the defendant guilty. Next would be Aaron Renee Henderson. Finding no appearances via Zoom, I'll note for the record that it's 5:12 p.m., 12 minutes past the start of court. Find that the defendant has not appeared, and based upon a non-appearance, I'll find the defendant is in default, and I'll find the defendant guilty of all 4 citations. I'll note for the record that 3 were retail theft, less than $500. And again, for restitution cases, I'm not going to be awarding any restitution this evening. Encourage if you've been a victim of theft, to file a restitution request with the court if you're so inclined, and we'll schedule that for a restitution hearing at a future date. Next would be Jonathan Marcial Hernandez Martinez. Mr. Hernandez Martinez paid the bond. I'll forfeit the bond, treat that as a no contest plea, find the defendant guilty. Tara Josephine Holte. Find that Tara Josephine Holte paid the bond. I'll forfeit the bond, treat that as a no contest plea, find the defendant guilty. Next would be Tyler Wharton. I'm checking Zoom. There's no additional participants in Zoom. I'll find the defendants based upon the defendant does not appear in court. Based upon the non-appearance, I'll find the defendant in default and find the defendant guilty. There was 2 citations, finding the defendant guilty of both. I'll note 1 was for retail theft. Again, I won't order restitution this evening, but if the victim wants to schedule a restitution hearing, please contact the court, fill out the required restitution documents, and then that will be scheduled for a restitution hearing at a future court date. Next will be Lanye Howell. Based upon, I'll find that there's nobody appearing via Zoom. Find the defendant did not appear. Based upon the non-appearance, I'll find the defendant in default and find the defendant guilty. Again, this was a retail theft case. For the retail theft, I'm not imposing restitution. The victim can request a restitution hearing by contacting the court, and that if that is for restitution hearing is requested, we'll schedule that at a future court date. Next will be Mary Huvila. Excuse me, Huvila. I'm seeing the listings on Zoom. Nobody is appearing in Zoom at this time. I'll find the defendant in default based upon the non-appearance. Since the defendant's not based upon the non-appearance, find the default judgment and find the defendant guilty. Next will be Angela Jensen. I'll note for the record that Ms. Jensen entered a no contest plea via mail. I'll accept that no contest plea to these 3 citations. Find the defendant guilty in all 3 and impose the face amount of the citation and grant 60 days to pay. Again, if the defendant needs more time or any defendant needs more time, we'll encourage you to contact the clerk, request more time. As stated at the beginning of the court, I'm going to be very liberal and forgiving in asking for requests for payment terms. As long as you ask and it's reasonable, I'm likely to grant it. All right, you ready for page 3, Mary?
Yes, I just have one note. That top person, I spoke with her this afternoon and she wants to enter a not guilty plea, so we can just cross her off and I'll schedule her for a pre-trial.
Who is that, Miss Jensen?
Correct, Johnson, Angela
Oh,
Johnson.
Angela Johnson, so you're jumping the gun then. Okay, thank you. I'm glad you jumped it. So we'll accept the not guilty plea for Angela Johnson. I will order that she attend a pretrial conference with the city attorney prior to the trial. The pretrial conference may be held via Zoom or other electronic means in compliance with the COVID-19 pandemic requirements. If there's any type of issues with this, either party is to notify the court. Thank you. All right. Ready for the next one?
Yes.
All right. The next will be Christina Johnson. All right. I'm reviewing Zoom, and there's same 4 participants, myself, the clerk, information technology, and WSTO. I'll note that the defendant is not appearing. Based upon the defendant's not appearance, I'll find the defendant in default and find the defendant guilty. This was a retail theft case. However, as stated earlier before, I'm not granting restitution at the hearing tonight. If the victim would like to request a restitution hearing, contact the court, request a restitution hearing, and one will be scheduled at a later court date. Next would be Jada Jones. Searching Zoom, no appearance. Based upon the non-appearance of the defendant, find the defendant in default and find the defendant guilty and impose the face amount of citation with 60 days to pay. Next would be Victor Damian Juarez. Mr. Juarez paid for the bond. I'll forfeit the bond, treat that as no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty.
And excuse me, the next person?
Yes.
Kennedy. She also called this afternoon, is entering a not guilty plea.
Well, court will accept the not guilty plea. We'll schedule the court order that this be defendant and city attorney appear at a pretrial conference to exchange information. Pretrial conference may be by Zoom or other electronic means, including the telephone, or that the pretrial conference take place shortly before the trial. Okay. Next would be Maria Esther Locken. All right. Reviewing Zoom, no appearance by the defendant based upon non-appearance. Court will find the defendant guilt in default, find the defendant guilty. And I'm getting it's almost time to restart. I'm going to click the not now button. All right. There was a pop-up on my screen, so. Interesting with the computer. So I found the defendants, Maria Esther Locken, in default and found her guilty. Did we receive any correspondence from the defendant?
No.
I'm going to give the defendant 90 days to complete an alcohol and drug class or alcohol and drug assessments. If the defendant does not complete that within 90 days and does not contact the court, I will order that the defendant have a 90-day driver's license suspension based upon an underage drinking citation. Okay, we ready?
Mhm.
Jared Long. Mr. Long paid the bond. I'll forfeit the bond, treat that as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Next would be Patrick Lord. Based, reviewing my Zoom settings, defendant does not appear. Based upon the non-appearance, I'll find the defendant guilty on both of these citations, or find the defendant in default and find him guilty in both citations with 60 days to pay. Next is Cassandra Lyons. I'm checking the Zoom settings. No appearance by the defendant. Based upon non-appearance, find the defendant in default and find the defendant guilty and for both citations, and order that payment be made within 60 days. Next is Shawn Lee Martin. Checking the Zoom settings, I'll note that there's no appearances. Based upon the non-appearance, find the defendant in default and find the defendant guilty and post the face amount of citations with 60 days to pay. Next is Eric Devon Miller. I will find that the note that no appearance by the defendant according to the Zoom settings. Note that the defendant, based upon non-appearance, find the defendant in default, find the defendant guilty.
And no contest plea.
Oh, this is Eric Devon Milner.
I'm sorry, maybe your list isn't updated. I think that came through yesterday.
Oh, okay. We'll treat that as a no contest plea. My apologies to the Mr. Milner. Yeah, if it came through yesterday, I wouldn't have received it. I probably printed this off yesterday afternoon. So
Right.
treat it as no contest plea. The court will find the defendant guilty and grant 60 days to pay. Next would be Justinian Minter. Mr. Minter paid the bond. I'll forfeit the bond, order the bond be forfeited rather. Treat that as no contest plea and find the defendant guilty. Danielle Marion Mitchell. I'll note that according to Zoom settings, there's no appearance by the defendant. Based upon the non-appearance of the defendant, find the defendant in default and find the defendant guilty. I'll note this was for a theft case. I'm not ordering restitution tonight, but I would encourage, or not encourage, if the victim would want to have a restitution hearing, the victim should make that request in writing to the court, and then a restitution hearing would be scheduled at a future court date. Next would be Carolina Milagros Munoz Salinas. Miss Munoz Salinas paid the bond. I'll forfeit the bond, treat that as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. John Curtis Nelson, I'll note that there's no appearance by the defendant. Find the defendant in default, find the defendant guilty of all 4 citations. Grant 60 days to pay. Defendant needs more time. Defendant will be encouraged to contact the court and request more time. As stated before, all reasonable requests will most likely be accepted for extending the period to pay. All right, how are you doing, Mary?
Good.
It's still dry, still need my water. All right, Kimberly Allison Neuenschwander. I'm checking the Zoom settings, finding that nobody is appearing based upon the non-appearance of the defendant. Find the defendant in default, find the defendant guilty, and order that the face amount of the citation be paid within 60 days. I'll note this was another retail theft case. I won't make any restitution awards this evening. However, if the victim wants to request a restitution hearing, the victim may file the restitution request with the court, and it will be scheduled. Restitution hearing will be scheduled at a future court date. Next would be Ronald Nicholson. Mr. Nicholson paid the forfeiture. I'll forfeit the bond, treat that as a no contest plea, find the defendant guilty. Ryan Joseph Novak. Mr. Novak paid the bond, order that the bond be forfeited, treat this as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty.
For O'Keefe,
Yes.
he did enter a no contest plea, and I think that came through today. And I do have his plea sheet attached.
Okay, I will check his plea sheet. Thank you. Okay, I have reviewed the plea sheets. Mr. O'Keefe provided proof of insurance. Based upon this proof, the court on its own motion is going to dismiss the operating motor vehicle without proof of insurance citation. The plea sheet did not mention anything about speeding on the city highway. I will treat the defendant's plea sheet as a no contest plea to speeding, find the defendant guilty, and impose the face amount of citation with 60 days to pay. Ready? Okay. Next would be David Olson. Mr. Olson paid the bond. I will order that the bond be forfeited, treat this as a no contest plea, find the defendant guilty. Next would be Danny Perkins. I'll find the defendant. Let me check Zoom settings. There's nobody appearing on Zoom. Based upon non-appearance, I'll find the defendant in default, and I'll find the defendant guilty. Pose the face amount of citation. This is a retail theft. I won't order restitution. But if the victim would like a restitution hearing, the victim can complete the restitution documents and request a restitution hearing, which would be scheduled for a future court date. Next would be Jennifer Stacy Perkins. According to Zoom settings, there's no appearance. Based upon non-appearance, I'll find the defendant guilty, or excuse me, find in default and find the defendant guilty of both citations. I'll note one was a retail theft. Again, no restitution, but the victim may request a restitution hearing, which will be scheduled at a future court date. Next would be a James Ratliff. No contest plea received. The court will accept the no contest plea, find the defendant guilty, and grant 60 days to pay. I'll notice this was a criminal damage to property. I'm not going to order restitution this evening, but if the victim wants a restitution hearing, the victim may file the restitution documents with court, and a restitution hearing will be scheduled at a future court date.
Yeah,
Next,
two
go ahead.
additional for the same person.
Oh, yes, we'll default, we'll treat that as no contest plea for all three and grant 60 days to pay. Okay, thank you. Ready?
Mm-hmm.
Sarah Roach. According to Zoom, no appearances. Based upon non-appearance, find the defendant in default, find the defendant guilty, and post the face amount of the citation. Timothy Roberts. No appearances. Based upon no appearances, find the defendant in default, find the defendant guilty, and post the face amount of the citations. Florida Robinson. Based upon the Zoom settings, no appearance by the defendant, find the defendant default, and find the defendant guilty and post the face amount of the citation. Next would be Miguel Micah Austin Rudd. The bond's been paid. I'll order that the bond be forfeited. Treat this as a no contest plea and find the defendant guilty of both citations. Ready for page 5? All right. Next would be Adrian Sanchez. The defendant paid the bond, ordered the bond be forfeited, treat this as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Chicory Olavi Santapaca. Bond's been paid, ordered the bond be forfeited, treat this as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Next would be Daniel James Santowski. Bond's been paid. I'll order the bond be forfeited, treat this as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Shaker's Saloon. No documents received. Checking the Zoom settings, there are no participants. Based upon the non-appearance of the defendant, find the defendant guilty and impose the face amount of citation with 60 days to pay. Default, guilty, 60 days to pay. Benjamin Anthony Syme. Checking the Zoom setting, no appearances. Based upon non-appearance of the defendant, find the defendant in default, find the defendant guilty, and impose the face amount of the citation. I'll note this is a retail theft case. However, I will not order restitution this evening. The victim would like a restitution hearing. The victim may request restitution documents and file them with the court. A restitution hearing would then be scheduled at a future court date. Amanda Strife. No participants via Zoom. Based upon non-appearance, find the defendant in default, find the defendant guilty, and impose 60 days to pay for the forfeiture. Again, more time is needed on these citations, please request more time in the court, and I will most likely grant any reasonable request. Katie Summers, no appearances via Zoom. I'll find the defendant in default, guilty, and impose these 60 days to pay. Gregory Swenson, no appearings on Zoom. Find the defendant based upon non-appearance. Find the defendant in default, guilty, with 60 days to pay. Rebecca Symes, no, I'm not finding any appearance on Zoom. Based upon non-appearance, I find the defendant in default. Find the defendant guilty. Impose the face amount of citation with 60 days to pay. Corey Thornton, paid the bond, ordered the bond be forfeited, treat that as no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. John Charles Thorpe, no appearances via Zoom. Based upon the non-appearance, find the defendant default, find the defendant guilty. Paid face amount of citation is ordered to be paid within 60 days. Jonathan Jose Torres Sanchez, the bond's been paid. I'll order the bond be forfeited, treat this as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Rebecca Warnke, the bond has been paid. I'll order that the bond be forfeited, treat this as a no contest plea, and find the defendant guilty. Courtney Carissa Watcher, checking Zoom, a defendant is currently participating in Zoom. Find the defendant in default, find the defendant guilty, and impose the face amount of the citation. Next would be Rebecca West. Checking Zoom, no appearances. Based upon the non-appearances, I find the defendant in default, guilty, and impose the face amount of the citation. This is restitution request, not ordering restitution this evening. I'll request that, or if the victim would like to request a restitution hearing, restitution may make a restitution request with the court. The court will schedule a restitution hearing at a future court date. Wayne West, I'll find the defendant. There's no appearances via Zoom. I'll find the defendant, based upon the appearance, I'll find the defendant default, find the defendant guilty, impose the face amount of the citation with 60 days to pay. This was a restitution, or this is a retail theft. I'm not ordering restitution. The victim would like to be paid restitution. The victim may file the restitution documents with the court. The court would then schedule a restitution hearing at a future court date. Andrew Wheeler, checking Zoom, no appearances by the defendant. Based upon an appearance, find the defendant in default, find the defendant guilty, and impose the face amount of the citation with 60 days to pay. Next would be Tyler Ziegler. Checking Zoom settings. The court will find that there are no people waiting on Zoom, and the Zoom settings don't indicate anybody is appearing. Based upon an appearance, will find the defendant in default, find the defendant guilty of both citations, grant 60 days to pay. And again, if anybody would like more time to pay, please make that request, and I will most likely grant all reasonable requests. That concludes. Yeah,
I have one correction. My mistake. Angela Johnson, the first one on page 3, I talked to her and she actually wants to enter a guilty plea. She was aware that there's a possibility of restitution, but she still would like to enter a guilty plea, not guilty.
I mean, not guilty?
Not guilty, guilty.
Okay, so I found her with a no contest plea, but that should have been a guilty plea.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, we'll change the no contest plea to a guilty plea and note that in the record.
All right.
Is that it for the initial appearances?
Yes.
Okay, I will note that we have a trial at 6 p.m. and we have what else do we have at 6 p.m.?
There's a hearing that was scheduled, but he did not respond, so he will be defaulting.
Okay. And then we have the trial at 6 for a speeding.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, all right, rather than record this whole section, I'm going to declare that the court's in recess now, and the court will re-adjourn at.
Okay, should I make you the host? Or does it not matter at this point?
It doesn't matter at this point. Okay, we'll call the court to session at this time. I'll note for the record that it is 6:11 p.m. We had a, let's see, we had a trial scheduled at 6 p.m. We'll get to that in a minute. I had a motion to reopen, or was it a motion to reopen for Stuart James Hallfelder? Mary?
That was, he had an indigency hearing in December, and I think he didn't bring proof of income. So you said to give him 6 months to see if things had changed and we would have another hearing. And he did not reply to the hearing.
Let's move that back 3 months. I anticipate we'll probably be having in-person court hearings in September, and why don't we reschedule till then?
Okay. All right.
You didn't receive any phone messages from Attorney Bailing or Mr. Friedrich?
Nope.
Is it Friedrich or Friedrich? Do you know?
I'm not sure.
Okay, we'll call him Mr. Friedrich. I'll check my emails to see if I received anything. Okay, I checked my emails and I didn't find anything either. So I'll note that it is now 6:13 p.m. I'll wait 2 more minutes and I'll go ahead and call the case. Okay, note for the record that at 6:15 PM, I'm going to call the case of Town of Dunkirk versus Mr. Stacy Friedrich. I have a screen. I'm looking at the, let's see, so Officer Mark Bach. And Mr. Bach, you, let's see, you're the officer in this case, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. My clerk is here, and I notice we have the WSTO, which is the cable outlet that broadcasts this. And there's also a participant information technology, John Montgomery. I don't see any appearances by Attorney Bailing, and I don't see any appearances by the defendant. And normally when this occurs, since Officer Bach, you're not an attorney, correct?
Correct.
But you did write a citation for the Town of Dunkirk in this case, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So this is an interesting finding. So the defendant's not here. So normally, if the attorney bailing should appear and the defendant did not, I could default the defendant. However, normally what happens is if the attorney doesn't appear, I'm at liberty to also dismiss the case based upon non-appearance. Under Wisconsin law, government agencies can only appear by an attorney. They can't appear by, can't appear by an officer or anyway. They're required to be attorney of law. Since we don't have an appearance by either side, I can't default and I can't dismiss this case given the fact that Officer Bach is here. So what I'm going to do is that with no appearances by, and I'll note for the record, just let me make the record clear that Attorney Bailing represents the Town of Dunkirk. It doesn't appear, and the defendant, Stacy Friedrich, doesn't appear either. So we don't have appearances by either side. And something unusual is this: instead of defaulting or dismissing, I'm actually going to continue this to another hearing. And I apologize, Officer Bach. I don't know why neither party decided, but I think my hands are tied in this case that I just have to continue the case and then send out notice again.
I mean, another trial.
Yes, another trial date.
Okay.
Would you have any dates in mind, Mary?
Would you prefer to have it a live hearing? Should I go after September?
Why don't you go after September? That way we can actually schedule a hearing.
October 21st.
Okay, we'll continue this trial date to October 21st. Again, Officer Bach, I apologize, but neither party appeared tonight. And I think that that's the thing to do is just continue this case for another time. At least you could appear by Zoom and then didn't have to waste time in the courtroom as far as non-appearance goes. So my apologies. We'll schedule this. We'll send out notice to both parties, both Attorney Bailing and the defendant, Mr. Stacy Friedrich. And then this case will be adjourned until then. Okay, thank you, Officer. Mary, anything else?
That's it.
Okay, court is adjourned. We'll go ahead and cancel the meeting. I think this worked very well. And then I will see you in, what's the next date, July 1st?
Correct, yes.
All right,